All right, we are going to start our second video by digging into our three research examples for the paradigms. We will start with the two sort of harder, we'll say harder paradigms, and I say harder not because they're necessarily harder, but because we, I think, are less familiar with them. And I'll start with the Alemann article, and these articles, by the way, are on Blackboard in the in-class activities folder. If you would like to look through any of them, I would encourage you to, I know in all of your spare time. So what I'll do for each article is run through these similar questions about how we can tell how these articles are exemplars of the different paradigms. So the first article is by Alemann, and it is an article about funding equity, or the lack of funding equity in the Texas financial system. And he uses a critical theory approach, and he makes this very clear in large part because he comes out and tells you, but also because of the assumptions that he articulates relating to power, the interaction between race and power, and the influence that that intersection has on the inequity or the structure of the system. We also know that it's critical theory because the author it describes being an active participant in the legislative process, trying to shape the outcome and to make the system more equitable. And he does this by using the research process to engage these superintendents from South Texas, these Latino superintendents from South Texas, in discussions about equity and the racism that the author believes to be inherent in the system, in an effort to sway their views. So the article is, and the author is overtly activist, it's overtly ideological. He states that race and racism is a normal and pervasive aspect of society, which is sort of a foundational tenet of critical race theory. And he asks, and one of his purposes is, what are stories that have been privileged and what stories and narratives have been marginalized? And he's trying to take those marginalized stories and bring them to the forefront. What ontological and epistemological positions does the article take, and how do we know? So the ontological position is sort of somewhere between material and ideal. And if we go back and think about what Gube and Lincoln say about critical theory, they say that critical theory, unlike postpositivism, kind of muddies the water on this issue of material and ideal. So it's a critical realism. So they believe that there is something real to study, but that something real to study has been shaped by these social forces and through processes of oppression. And so they also assume that there are different ways of knowing, and this is really important on Alemann's argument, because he posits that these superintendents really should be seeing things differently. And he adopts this perspective that attempts to privilege, quote unquote, research grounded in the experiences and knowledge of people of color, with the understanding that those experiences and that knowledge often are different, and that traditional research methods and research approaches don't distinguish and don't seek to distinguish that there's different narratives. The author's also trying to contextualize the policy and to understand the way context helps to make meaning. The epistemological position is one of understanding. So he's seeking to understand the discourse, shaping of discourse, and the role that values and politics play in shaping understanding. How is the central problem of the article defined? So it's defined in part as trying to understand how we got this inequitable funding system in Texas for our schools, the role that race and power play in perpetuating a fundamentally inequitable system. But he's also interested in the role that these superintendents play and their lack of critical consciousness and their lack of wanting to, what he would say, sort of call a spade and say the system is racist, and not sort of let politics essentially run them over. What assumptions does the article make about the problem, and how are those assumptions informed by the paradigm adopted? So the article assumes that the system, the finance system, is racist in its intent and its design. And of course, this is important because often we differentiate, and often it's very important to differentiate intent and design versus outcomes. So for example, in voter rights, discussions about voter rights, often people say, well, the way that, for example, redistricting happens may lead to inequitable or racist appearing outcomes, but the system itself is not racist. And what he's saying about the finance system is that it is intentionally designed to hurt children of color and to privilege white children and wealthy children. And then the article or the author also assumes that through the reframing of the system and the problem, that new solutions will appear. So it's very important for the author to tell a different story and to be very explicit about the story that he's telling. And number 5, how does the paradigm guide the choice of methods in the article as well as the discussion of the implications of the findings? So his design is, it's a qualitative study, and he interviews 8 Mexican-American superintendents in South Texas. And he is interested in telling their story and making, on the one hand, sort of helping them trying to understand their positions, but it's also an activist, because of the activist purpose. He uses the interviews also as a way to try to convince them, try to, remove the veil from their eyes so that they see the system for what it is. The next article, Cochran, Smith, and Fries, is an article. It is a discourse analysis about teacher education and 2 discourses about teacher education. And this article represents the interpretivist paradigm. And we know this because the paper focuses on understanding the discourse around teacher preparation and how those 2 sets of discourse are different and how they're constructed. So how the meaning that is contained in those discourses, how that meaning is made. And that's how we know that it's interpretivism, because it's really about what do these mean? Where did the meaning come from? The authors explicitly note that they're not trying to argue that one is right or one is true. And that's an important distinction from critical theory, which would say, yes, one is right and one is true, or one is right and one is wrong. Maybe not true, but wrong. And here they're saying, no, we just want to understand. We really want to understand. And they're arguing these positions are constructed based on very different political beliefs and values. Ontological and epistemological positions. The authors do not claim to be able to know the truth. So this is more of an idealist ontology. An idealist being, again, sort of rooted in ideas. It's very relative, right? How you understand teacher education is really about your context, your ideology, your political values. So if that's the case, then there can't be one position, one right interpretation of teacher education. Their approach to learning about the 2 discourses is through contextualization and deep analysis of the language and the environment in which both discourses were incubated. The central problem is trying to understand the nature of these competing discourses, which are very polarized. I'm sure you've all heard different arguments about the value, the relative value and merit of teacher education. And if you're familiar with those discourses, you know that it's very bitter. The assumptions. So the authors assume that there's no one right way to think about the policy issue. And they also assume, again, that the discourse is grounded in these underlying political and ideological beliefs. So you can deconstruct the meaning and tie that back to actors or groups, beliefs, and values. And finally, the paradigm and the methods. So the data that comprise this study involve texts and public speech, policy documents. They're really interested also in the context. And this aligns, of course, with the purpose of understanding and identifying the way discourse is constructed. So meaning making. So looking back to those texts and trying to see, what do they say? where were they written, when were they written, who wrote them, who said them, and trying to use that to understand what is the meaning and where did it come from. And discourse analysis is the tool of analysis, which is a very, very interesting tool. I encourage you to read into it if you're interested in understanding sort of meaning making. It's defined as the way we examine how different versions of the world are produced through texts and talk. And our final article, Gottfried and Plasman, a very recent publication, a very interesting article. And this article represents the last but not least, the post-positivist paradigm. And we know this because of the purpose. The purpose of the article is to reveal some underlying truth about the relationship between career technical education course taking and certain student outcomes. They want to produce generalizable results, something that helps not only one school or one district, but districts and schools across multiple states and across even the country. In other words, they assume that there is some underlying true relationship that can be studied through observation. And in this case, that observation comes through analyzing data that's already been collected. What ontological and epistemological positions does the article take? So the article they don't articulate a specific position. And this is really typical for this kind of work. This is the quote unquote traditional way we think about science and knowledge and what is knowledge and how do we know. But it's very much a realist or a critical realist position in terms of the ontology. So there is this truth out there and we can get pretty close to it. And the epistemological position is we get to know that truth, or we get closer to that truth through empirical observation. How is the central problem of the article defined? So the authors note several gaps in the literature, and they note these gaps. There's 3, and they say this is the problem. The problem is there's these things that we still need to learn, and so it's not about putting out or privileging voices that have been marginalized. It's not about understanding how meaning, different interpretations came to be. It's really trying to say there's these relationships that nobody's investigated yet. And we think that they're potentially important because the literature suggests that they should be. And so we're going to test these hypotheses about what these relationships look like. And the assumptions, so that the problem is defined as a gap in our knowledge. And so that assumes that we can learn about this objectively, and we can fill in this gap with new objective knowledge. And again, that's very post-positivist, this idea that we're just accumulating knowledge. How does the paradigm guide the choice of methods? So the study leverages this large secondary, secondary means pre-existing, so somebody else collected the data. And these data contain observable student and school traits. So for example, courses that students take, and student sex, and their race, and their ethnicity, and their socioeconomic background. And the authors assume, and this approach assumes, that these measures and these statistical tests are going to help them and us get closer to a truer understanding of the relationships and to an answer. And so that the implications for the findings, of course, would be then that these findings should be generalizable. All right, so in Blackboard, if you please take a few minutes and just answer these questions, sort of which paradigm do you relate to most and why? Which paradigm do you relate to least and why? Which paradigm do you think would be most appropriate for you, or for what you are interested in studying and why? And I'm particularly interested in that last piece because we're going to continue to talk about this issue and think about your future research in this class. Finally, preview of next week. The research process in Gall and Borg is on Blackboard. Please download it, read it. You don't need to print it, but please read it. Read another article. Was really pleased to see some of the articles that you all found. I even downloaded some of them myself because I will be reading them as well for my own research purposes and interests. The focus for next week is breaking down the research process, problems, purposes, and questions. We will be coming up with our own questions. And please don't forget that assignment 1 is coming due very shortly. Look at those resources. I think you will find them very helpful. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Monday.